within the context of what will tax look like under Labour, we've been asked by a couple of our subscribers to take a look at what tax was like under the last Labour government and to see whether we can draw any conclusions from that or be informed by that as to what tax might look like under this government, given that some comparisons have been made between Tony Blair and Keir Starmer. We know that Blair and the Blair Institute have been advising Keir Starmer and that he values, it seems, I will not talk to him, but it seems he values the input from the Blair Foundation or institution, whatever it's called. So there is that. However, the key thing to remember here, and we talked about this in an earlier video, is that the last Labour government operating between 1997 and 2010 was operating in a very different, largely much more benign and positive economic time than the current government. So any comparison or extrapolation, that's probably the better word. It's a nice word as well, extrapolation, from the last set of tax changes that were made by the Labour government in that period is probably flawed, because tax changes being made to deal with ideology and philosophy of the particular party, of course, but also in relation to necessity, driven by the economic circumstances of that particular government was working in, were very, very different. So when you've got that difference, it means that the tax changes that emerged in that time and what may emerge in the current time there's probably very little that you can draw from the past tax changes to help you in thinking ahead as to what these changes might be, which of course we may well know with a little more certainty once we've had at least the first budget, especially given if you are going to make any tax changes and they are not likely to be received particularly well by some parts of the voting population, you probably do it earlier in your term than later. So all that being said, and having said in that last video, but I'll just remind you that the economic times are very different. Two parts of the economic times will make that very clear. One, that for the large part of the last term in office of the Labour Party, we were looking at a growth rate of something like 2.5%, up until we had the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And then we had also a debt to GDP ratio that was vastly, dramatically below what it is currently. Currently, we know it's hovering around 100%. Not surprising because of all the borrowing that took place to fund pandemic and energy support, and then of course all the extra costs of NHS and all of that goes with it. The borrowing has been much, much greater in the Conservatives' time, as it were, than it was needed to be under Labour, where we were operating with the peace dividend. No need to do that. No climate change to fund. We didn't have a pandemic. The global financial crisis hadn't hit because we're still carrying some of the output from that. So really, it was a very, very different time. And the debt GDP ratio then was, for a large part of the Labour Party rule, as it were, was around 40%. So it's unbelievable, 40%, whereas currently it's 100. So that was the context. So given that, what tax changes actually did take place? So let's just go back in time and consider some of those tax changes. And in this video, I'll consider, first of all, the sort of key taxes, first two key, income tax and capital gains tax. So what about income tax? Well, there was a manifesto pledge, remember, very similar to this manifesto pledge. The manifesto pledge that was made in 1997 was, we won't raise basic or top rate of tax in this parliament. And they didn't. They stuck to it. Apart from post-global financial crisis increase in the top rate to 50% for taxable income over 150,000. And we're still living with that additional rate, albeit at 45%. And tapering the personal allowance, both of which started under George Osborne's reign as the Chancellor. Not only that, but the basic rate of income tax was actually cut from 23% at the start of Labour Party's term in office to 20% by 2008, 2009. Gordon Brown also actually flirted with a 10% starting rate band, which was eventually abandoned in 2008 because of circumstances. However, what we also need to bear in mind, and there's a great similarity here, is that stealth taxes and their accomplice, effectively fiscal drag, were also at play back then, not because thresholds were frozen, not because of that, but because the rate of increase in the thresholds was lower than the rate of increase in wages. Dividend taxation changed quite dramatically as well. Most importantly, the dividend tax credit was removed, meaning that pension funds, and this is really important, pension funds and also ISAs couldn't claim back the tax credit. And this had a huge, obviously negative effect, especially on defined benefit schemes. In relation to capital gains tax, then in 1998, indexation was frozen and taper relief was introduced. Remember that? Taper relief. 10 years later, taper relief and the remnants of indexation were both scrapped, and a flat rate of 18% was introduced for all capital gains. So that's what went on under the Labour Party. And the exception to that was for gains on disposal of business assets, when entrepreneurs relief, it's now called business assets disposal relief, that was introduced, which qualified for a 10% rate. So that's what we were looking at there back in the day in relation to income tax and capital gains tax and dividend tax. I'll look at ISAs, mortgage interest relief, corporation tax, inheritance tax and pensions in a following video.